Hi.
Hey.
It's great to talk to you today, Sarah. For virtual YAVs who will be watching this, hello. Good to project into the future to see you all. My name is Allison Wood. I'm the site coordinator of the Tucson Borderlands YAV program here in Tucson, Arizona on unceded Tohono O'odham land. And you all already know Sarah from her amazing book study. But I don't know if you want to refresh, Sarah.
Hey, y'all. Good to check in with you this new year, awaiting what happens for us in 2021 and starting off with big things because there's still big things to deal with in the world. But yeah, in case you've forgotten, site coordinator in Colombia, and delighted to be chatting today with my good friend Allison about these big and important issues. I'm so glad that you suggested we pick up this topic, Allison, because it's pretty much, pervasive in our life and assumptions and reality, and not just in the United States, but around the world in different ways to different extents. U.S. militarism has its impact, and local governments and societies also have their own dynamics dealing with that issue of militarism. So it's a big one, and it's something I've been passionate about for a long time. I think especially since I got involved in Colombia and I have a much more sort of tangible face to put on it from the people I know whose lives have been so clearly impacted. I mean, my own life in Los Angeles growing up was also impacted, but I wasn't necessarily as aware of it until I got involved with the accompaniment program in Colombia. And now that I've been living and working here, it's definitely sort of at the forefront. So thanks for bringing this up for us. What led you to want to delve into this today?
Yeah, thanks. I'm so excited that you wanted to share your experiences and thoughts and questions, and that we can talk about it and invite YAVs. I invite you all to think and wonder and question and talk about it as well. I think for me, militarization is something that I started learning about as a process when I moved to the border here, to the U.S.-Mexico border. I've been in Tucson for 10 years, and that whole time have been learning about the buildup of militarized enforcement, which is a phrase that I say a lot, but it took me a while to actually think about, oh, this means we're treating this kind of police force or law enforcement body as a military. And what does that actually mean? And where does that come from? And have been taught by really amazing teachers here who have been in struggle for liberation for decades, who have helped me see that and help all of us see that the way that the U.S. chooses to enforce our border, particularly the border with Mexico, is a deliberate choice for violence. Like, we deliberately elect to use violence, the military, like sending the National Guard down to put up concertina wire on the fence, as the Trump administration did last year and the year before, and that we choose exclusion, and this kind of assumption I had coming into the borderlands, as I grew up in the suburbs of Virginia, was that this is just what a border looks like, and that actually it's something that we've created, that we've intentionally elected to do things this way. And that the way that our border looks, the way we enforce our border, has grown out of a really complex tangle of ways that the United States as a society, as an entity, if we can call a country an entity with a million bodies, has chosen to show up in the world and engage in the world. And so I think for me, the more that I learned about militarism and what that looks like and what it means, the more I see it everywhere. To hear how you've seen it.
Yeah.
I think I do kind of want to set a disclaimer, which is that I'm not an expert in the military, and we're not talking really today about military service members, about the choice to military service, even about like the military necessarily, but about what are these kind of driving forces that have built the military, particularly the U.S. military, but other places as well, as we understand it today. Does that sound fair to you?
Yeah, absolutely. We are going to take some time just to talk through some of the different issues and elements that stand out to us and that, kind of tie in to this question that you brought up: why this choice to have this approach to controlling uh, the reality that we live in and that we inhabit, and so some of the folks who are watching and will be looking forward to hearing from you too, your own experiences and opinions and everything, but we're not trying to question the motivations of your Aunt Vanessa or your father who may have had military service in their background or something. That's not really what we're getting to, but just to bring it back to what's the bigger picture of the impact of this decision, like as a society, to have this approach to trying to enforce a certain vision of security, a certain vision of what it means to be an ordered society, and I was remembering too and thinking about that quote for the YAVs who did the Bible study. And if you remember, I mentioned briefly, I think, and it's in the printed Bible study from the PMA, a little bit about how our personal intentions don't necessarily impact the end result of oppressive systems and structures that we might be part of. So we're not trying to talk about the hopes and dreams of individuals who participate in militarization because that's their job or whatever, and they may have any number of reasons why they got involved in that, but we're thinking about why this approach as a society or from our government, but we're all implicated in what our government does. So looking at it kind of that bigger picture.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, thank you. I think for me too, a lot of this is about questioning our assumptions of why the world works the way that it does, or why the world is the way that it is. And so that is very true in militarism. And I brought up, in thinking about why the border looks the way that it does. But when we talk about questioning assumptions, I think also we have to talk about white supremacy and race and racism. And so,
that's super clear, right? In the border, because we compare the U.S.-Mexico border to the U.S.-Canada border, for example. Like, it's just, how could it be more obvious that our idea of who needs a militarized border, to the extent, I mean, there's also militarization of the U.S.-Canada border, but not nearly to the extent that there is with the border with Mexico. And what is a pretty clear salient element of the difference there?
It could be race. That could be a part of it. I think, and part of that is how clearly race lets us define people as other. That, to use this example, and maybe my last bit of disclaimer is like, all of these things are much more complicated than we can talk about in this 3-hour-long video for people to watch. But like talking broadly about like kind of stereotypes that live in our cultural thinking, Canadians look like us and speak the same language as us meaning United Statesians, and therefore like we can have a closer relationship with them. But Mexicans are different, and we have been taught implicitly and explicitly that different is scary.
Yeah, absolutely. And the ways that we want to control that scariness. And sometimes just because of a single case, we want to make that other sound dangerous or threatening to us. And maybe there was one thing that happened one time that was scary or dangerous, but that doesn't mean that a whole body of people is then to be kind of labeled that way.
Yeah. One of the characteristics of white supremacy culture is either or thinking. And so really putting things in binaries. And we see that a lot around the border, but also more broadly in this idea of like good guys and bad guys. And so one of the places we see it in the border is our soon-to-be outgoing President Trump in his campaign launch speech, who said, you know, Mexicans are sending rapists and some of them are good people, which is clearly just terrible. And we can say, okay, some people are racist, rapists, and some people are good people. And there's not an acknowledgement of like, all people are human beings and are complex. And so we need to define people into these categories of not just good people and bad people, but us and them. And that one of the things that we think safety means is keeping us safe, keeping me safe and my people from other people versus other people.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things that kind of tangentially speaking, you know, in the YAV program, we work on self-exploration and self-knowledge, and recognizing those complexities and imperfections within ourselves is also part of the process of, you know, realizing we're not the good guys, and maybe the bad guys aren't just bad guys either. You know, we're all complex and do intentional or unintended damage to each other and to ourselves at different times. And it's true on the individual level, and it's also true kind of the community, family, societal levels as well. So just trying to stop with the black and white, either or, good guys, bad guys kind of framework.
Yeah. Let's see. Can I share this comic now? I think this is applicable here. Just wanted to share this with you all. It's from an online comic strip called Assigned Male Comics. It's written by a trans artist. And so there's 4 panels here. I don't know if anyone's listening and not able to see. The first is a person who says, violence is never the solution. And then a person replying, oh, so you agree we shouldn't give weapons to the police. And then in the third panel, that same person saying, and that we should dismantle the army. And then in the last panel, that person leaning in close, the second person leaning in close to say, or did you mean that violence is only a solution when it helps maintain the status quo? And maybe we'll come back to this and talk more about the status quo, but I'm reminded of this idea of like, some violence is good and some violence is bad. And like weapons or violence is okay when it's on the side of good and right, and particularly used by people in power. So
yeah, exactly. It's a way of kind of justifying our desire to protect ourselves. And we have this, I think it's been pretty adequately debunked through so many studies and research and examples. Like, violence doesn't really make us safe, because violence always does harm to somebody, you know, but we have this idea of justifying maintaining an armed force to do the bidding of the supposedly legitimate authorities, you know. And throughout human history, I think this has been the case, you know, kings and emperors and such with their militaries and their guards and everything too, representing this kind of threat power of, if you don't do what we tell you to do, then there's going to be consequences to your physical safety, and trying to keep people in check that way, right? And as long as we accept the idea that that's legitimate, that the one in power wielding that threat force is entitled to do that, and they are the keepers of good, then everything is great. But, you know, it's also been the case throughout pretty much all of human history, as far as I'm aware, that, you know, that idea of, well, who's good is being defended by this force. And, you know, here we get to the idea of the problem of othering as well. And like in the context of the United States, you know, the police are easy to be accepted as the good guys as long as you're a member of, you know, the privileged, especially white segment of society that it doesn't really get involved in the enforcement side of policing unless you happen to call the police for help. Otherwise, you don't engage with the police, and you assume that they're just there to help you. But we know that that's a lot more complicated. So we need to question what's really going on here, and is the violence that's being done on our behalf really doing good? I mean, it might sometimes accomplish a result that we think, the ends justify the means, right? Sometimes maybe this is getting too complex ethical discussion territory, but hopefully people are on board for this. Like, that's one of the fundamental questions, right? Do the ends justify the means? Is having people with guns and sticks and bombs and tanks and every other level of militarized equipment that we're adding to our defense forces of whatever kind, like, does that justify, is that justified because we keep, suburban white people comfortable and feeling safe? I don't personally think that it does. I don't think. But yeah, asking those questions gets complicated, right? And you can be dismissed as like this fringe element just for questioning the motivations or the decision to have that, because it's become such a part of, and it's like all throughout our culture, right? We have so many movies and TV shows that are about law enforcement, that are about the military, that are about the good guys winning and using violence to protect us from the bad guys. Even like our superheroes a lot of the time are doing the same thing, right? They're using violence in most cases, but it's supposed to be redemptive. It's supposed to be protective.
Yeah. It is. Even when we started talking about this and started preparing for today, I have just this feeling of like, okay, you tug one little thread and then it's connected to all these different questions and all these different wonderings. That it's not just about why do we choose to use force on the global stage, but there are all these other things underneath.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Speaking of being a fringe element, I'm reminded that as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we're meant to be people of nonviolence. And that doesn't, I mean, this again is a whole other topic, but that doesn't mean be passive. But it does mean, choose the way of turning the other cheek and the resistance to empire that represents versus taking up our swords.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure how many of the YAVs did read it, but I included the kind of Walter Wink take on the Matthew 5 stuff and turn the other cheek as one of the optional readings for the Bible study.
If you haven't read it, it's so good.
It's really good. Yep.
Great. Okay, so we've talked about some of these, like the orientations or priorities kind of simmering under the surface. So white supremacy, white body supremacy, this idea of safety and keeping us safe or keeping some people safe, the polarization of good guys and bad guys, and how we define people as the other because they're bad guys or so that they can become bad guys, and this assumption that violence is the answer. Are there any other like kind of foundational ideologies before we get into like kind of history and what's going on now?
Yeah, one thing I think just on that last point that it's good to, like, we've been talking about it, but just to state clearly again, as far as like using violence, but we don't call ourselves violent. Like, we use violence as a label for the other to justify our use of violence, right? So as soon as I talk about, this violent element, violent extremists, that justifies my preparation to be violent in response, or even anticipating that they will be violent, I'm going to be violent first. But we don't label ourselves that way because we still, kind of as a society, respond to, that's a violent criminal. To be labeled as violent is a bad thing, even while we're simultaneously amassing all of these weapons and everything. And that's one of the things that stood out to me when I went back to watch again the clip from Eisenhower's farewell speech that you had brought up when we were planning, is how, you know, he's trying to kind of straddle both sides of this, like recognizing that there's a danger to building up so much military might and allowing like the business side of it and the industrial like side of having like the military be this huge force in our economy and our society. Like there's danger there, but he still wants to say at the same time, you know, it's important for us to have this sort of threat power amassed. Like we need this powerful army and military so that everybody's afraid to mess with us.
Right.
And he's trying to kind of dance on both sides of that line.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Do you think we should show that a clip from his?
Yeah, I'll just say, in case folks don't know, that Dwight Eisenhower was the President of the United States, the 34th President from 1953 to 1961. I do have the Wikipedia page open. I don't just know this off the top of my head. But he was also a 5-star general in World War II and supreme commander of some kind of allied forces in Europe. And so this man who was deeply steeped in the military and a leader of the military and who became a leader of the country. And the clip you're going to play is from his like farewell address when he was leaving the presidency. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Cool. So it's in the context of like the U.S. has been through World War II and is entering it has been in the beginning, early stages of what the Cold War is shaping up to be and will continue for a couple of decades still after this speech. So we'll listen to just a couple of minutes of it. And this clip does not have the video included, but hopefully you'll be able to hear him well. I'll just play about 2 minutes of it.
A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society.
Whew. Whew. I scribbled down a whole bunch of notes. I'm wondering what about that clip felt really important to share, or like what jumped out at you? What are some of the things that jumped out at you from that particular clip?
I think to me, I mean, it's helpful just to be aware, first of all, as somebody who was born, I was born in 1980. And so kind of at the end of the Cold War and moving into the drug war phase in US history. And I don't think I was, aware until I was an adult, basically, of the fact that the US didn't have, a huge standing army and these, millions of people ready to be shipped off all over the world forever. It wasn't just all like that. So that's one thing that's really important to be aware, as he points out, like this is something that was really new at that moment in history. After the US had worked up all of that capacity for military industry and military service, it just continued that after World War II. Whereas before, you pull an army together and get people trained as the need arose, or was determined, not to justify that it was necessarily ever necessary. But so just to see that was not always the way it was done. But we assume now that it must continue that way.
Yes.
Right? And seeing how
those assumptions.
also is feeling like he's feeling the need for it to continue that way, I think, which is something that I think the way that I've in the past heard references to this speech and his talking about the military industrial complex, I've heard that represented in a way that makes him sound more like the prophet ringing the warning bells, which he does a little bit, but he's also clearly saying that yes, we need to have this strong military. Our current circumstances require us to maintain this. At the same time, we want to avoid somehow having undue influence on the global stage because of this. And we don't want to have our great minds and thinkers only absorbed in this kind of military strategy and this militarized mentality. He's trying to warn against these things while he's saying, yes, we need this, but it's dangerous. And I think that really sets up, he was visionary in a way in terms of being aware of, I think, what he was afraid of has happened to a large degree. We have so much of our collective wealth and energy spent on reinforcing and maintaining and ever improving and advancing this militarized machine. Yeah. What did you hear there?
Yeah, I was also struck by, he used the phrase, he talks about how we need to set up a permanent armaments industry. And living in Tucson, where there is an Air Force base here, but there are also Caterpillar headquarters and a lot of Raytheon engineering and production. And Raytheon is making drones and bombs all the time, and it's just part of the economy now. And so some of this brings up for me how hard it, even if we collectively decided we want to divest from the military, we want to invest in other things, how hard that will be or would be. I was struck by his use of humble American plowshare makers can beat their plowshares into swords, and that deliberate reversal of the biblical phrase. And then also heard him talk about the military complex having an influence in every arena of our life, and he named a spiritual influence. And I wonder, again, okay, so there's the financial influence or implication of this investment in military force as the way that we're going to be in the world, and that has implications for people's lives and the way that our cities are designed, and I wonder also what influence it has on our spirits.
That's a really profound question. That reminds me of one of the things that I see as this kind of contradictions so often, and like the US mentality as it's represented, you know, in pop culture and kind of the dominant narratives and everything. Like we identify so strongly with the underdog, and then as Christians, you know, we read the Bible and we identify, you know, with Israel in captivity and exile in Babylon, and we want to read these stories and see ourselves as underdogs. But then at the same time, we have this clear grasp of like wanting to always at all costs hold on to as much power to be the tough guys, to be the winners, to always be number one, to make sure nobody ever gets the best of us. Like there's this really strong push in that direction at the same time, and it seems like it's not even something that we recognize collectively. Like what's going on here, that we want to paint ourselves as the oppressed somehow, but we also want to be the ones who can make sure that we're never oppressed by anyone. And the ways that we then wind up oppressing others out of that like fear of winding up on the other side.
Yeah, even
spiritual issue.
The very first like phrase or sentence of that clip that you played was, he said that he said a vital element of keeping the peace is the military. And so I'm thinking again about what you talked about like others are labeled as violent, but we keep the peace. We do that through violence, but you know, we're not violent, we're keeping the peace, or we're protecting, or we're liberating, or you know.
Yeah, exactly. But is there really peace if it's something that's maintained by the threat of violence? I don't call that peace.
It's a pretty good question. Yeah.